Hey there, sleepless rabble. Let me take over for a while. Tonight's sleep story isn't about kings, or war, or ancient secrets. It's about something much more dangerous beauty. Because long before contour sticks and collagen drinks, people were already hurting themselves to look better. Only the tools were different. Instead of LED masks and brow gel, they used quicklime, vinegar, and powdered bone. Instead of saying, hot girl summer, they said prayers and plucked their eyebrows for holiness. And instead of posting selfies, they died quietly, but beautiful. Or at least pale enough to pass for divine. If you've ever spent too much on a serum, regretted a bleach job, or fallen for a trend that promised to change your life and only ruined your skin barrier, then congratulations. You're part of a very long tradition. Before we dive in, like this video if you're into beautifully grim history. Subscribe if you want more late night madness, and tell me in the comments, what's the most ridiculous thing you've ever done to look good? Bonus points if it involved fire, acid, or your mum's tweezers. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to What Medieval Women Did for Beauty Makes TikTok Trends Look Harmless. Now, let's begin. It always starts with the face, not the clothes, not the jewelry, not even the hair, just the face. Unadorned, undeniable, exposed to every glance and judgment. And somewhere near the top of that face, the brows, two little arches, barely strips of hair really, but so loaded with meaning that entire eras have risen and fallen around what we thought they should look like. Today, they're laminated, brushed, bleached, or tattooed. They're groomed into identity. A good brow can lift your whole face. A bad one can collapse your self-worth before breakfast. But in the Middle Ages, the ideal was simple. No brow at all. Beauty in the 14th century didn't aim to accentuate. It aimed to erase. Women didn't sculpt their brows. They annihilated them. Each morning, noble ladies, sometimes even young girls, sat at low mirrors, lit by flickering tallow candles, and began the quiet, violent ritual of subtraction. Eyebrows were plucked out, strand by strand. Eyelashes too. Even the hairline was shaved or torn back with combs to create that holy grail of medieval aesthetics. The elevated, sacred forehead. It wasn't vanity, it was virtue. A large, empty forehead meant piety. It recalled the serene faces of saints in stained glass and stone. Still, pale, expressionless. A woman without brows couldn't flirt. She couldn't frown. She couldn't suggest rebellion or desire. And that made her safe. Because in a world where beauty was measured by spiritual submission, your face wasn't yours. It belonged to the church, to your husband, to the silent gaze of men who judged women not by their thoughts, but by how well they seemed to have none. Some went further. They used concoctions made from quicklime and vinegar to permanently damage the follicles. Walnut oil was another favourite, rubbed deep into the skin to poison the roots. If it burned, blistered, or scarred, all the better. Suffering purified the look. And this wasn't fringe behaviour. This was trend. This was expected. In castles and cloisters alike, women bore their empty brows like a badge of honour. To have a fully grown pair was shameful, earthy, vulgar, perhaps even heretical. The face had to be blank, because the soul, presumably, was not. Of course, this ritual wasn't about personal choice, not really. It was about fitting in, being worthy, playing the part. Just as today, where the brow says everything about how we want to be seen, bold, soft, clean, chaotic, so too did the absence of a brow speak volumes. It said, "I am obedient, I am untouched, I am what you want me to be." And as strange as it sounds, we haven't moved that far. A scroll through any beauty feed will show brows that signal status, intention, taste. Some women bleach them into nothing. Others microblade them into permanent poses. And still, the unspoken pressure remains. Control the brow. Control the perception. But the face didn't end there. Because once the brows were gone and the canvas laid bare, there was one more step. Perhaps the most important of all. The skin. And not just any skin. The right skin had to glow, not with life or colour, but with something colder. Something untouchable. In the next room, across the echoing floor of a stone manor, a woman dips her fingers into a small ceramic pot. She lifts a creamy white substance to her face. Thick, cool, strangely sweet smelling. She smooths it onto her cheeks, her forehead, her neck. She's not applying makeup. She's applying power. Because in the Middle Ages, beauty didn't blush. It shimmered with the dead light of lead. And that is where we go next. Because once the brows were gone and the face erased, something had to fill the void. Not colour. Certainly not warmth. But glow. The skin had to shine. Smooth, pale, poreless. The kind of skin that suggested distance. From labour, from heat, from emotion. A surface that reflected not light, but purity. In the medieval imagination, pale skin wasn't just elegant, it was sacred. A sign that the body had been tamed, cooled, silenced. That the soul inside it had risen above the animal and the flesh. But no one was born that way. So they made it happen. The most popular method? Ceruse. A soft white paste made from lead soaked in vinegar, left to ferment in clay jars for weeks. It looked like cream, spread like paint, and slowly destroyed the person beneath it. Women applied it daily, layer by layer. Face, neck, chest, even shoulders. Anywhere that might be seen. Anywhere that needed to disappear. It covered freckles, scars, redness. It masked disease, exhaustion, aging. It turned human faces into pale illusions. Statues come to life with none of the mess. And it worked. For a while. Until the leader began to seep inward. Into the bloodstream. Into the bones. It weakened muscles, rotted teeth. Discolored the very skin it was meant to perfect. But the alternative, natural, flawed, visible, was worse. Because this wasn't about looking pretty, it was about looking untouchable. The same logic appears in quieter forms today. Skin that gleams with highlighter. Foundations promising blurred perfection. Serums that claim to erase texture, memory, identity. The tools have changed. The goal hasn't. We still ask skin to hide us. To convince the world that we are above damage, effort, time. And the more money you had in the Middle Ages, the purer your glow. Wealth meant access to better powders. Crushed pearl, chalk from the Alps, finely milled bone. The poor used flour or ash, which clumped and faded quickly. But even they tried. Because even they knew. A pale face opened doors. Especially when paired with silence. But as the centuries wore on, something began to creep back in. Colour. It started faint. Barely visible. A subtle flush at the cheeks. A touch of red on the lips. Dangerous. Suggestive. Alive. Because while the church preached restraint, the body still remembered. And some women wanted to be seen. So next, we turn to the one thing that threatened the sacred glow. That whispered of heat and breath and appetite. Rouge. and the bloody little lies that came with it. It crept back slowly, first as a rumour, then a whisper, and finally, a risk worth taking. Colour. For decades, the glow had reigned supreme. White skin, blank skin. Skin that said, I do not sweat, suffer, or sin. But nothing stays pure forever, especially not in the mirror, because even the most pious faces began to long for a hint of warmth. A touch of red that said, yes, I'm breathing. Yes, I'm alive. And so, the rouge returned. Not loudly, not all at once, just a dusting. Just enough to suggest that your blood still moved beneath the powder. Of course, it had to be subtle. Too much red on the cheeks. And you were no longer holy. You were a harlot. The line between beauty and shame ran directly through the face. And it changed with every glance. In courtly circles, a faint flush was charming. In the wrong company, it became an accusation. Lust, vanity, heat, all the things women weren't supposed to have, were written in that single smudge of red. Still, they wore it. Crushed beetles, red wine sediment, cinnabar, mercury sulfide ground into powder and brushed across the cheeks, or mixed into wax and smeared on the lips. A dangerous smile, a borrowed heartbeat, proof that you were not entirely gone. And let's not pretend this has vanished. Rouge, blush, tint, stain, still walks the same tightrope. Today it's sunburn blush, cherry cola lips, cold girl makeup, all designed to mimic the exact same thing. A body alive with feeling, but somehow still clean. Because too much? You look unstable. Too little? You look tired. It must look natural, but also flawless. Accidental, but curated. In the Middle Ages, they had to be careful where they bought their rouge. Certain sellers were known to lace it with toxins. Mercury, again, or lead. It gave better colour. It also shortened your life. But what was that, compared to being noticed? Some women painted on their colour only in secret. At home, before a lover, before a scandal. Others wore it under their veils, waiting to be close enough for someone to see. And once the taste for red returned, there was no turning back. Even the church couldn't erase it, because the need to be seen, truly seen, will always outweigh the rules that say you shouldn't be. But red wasn't the only way to stand out. There was something else, something older, a shimmer, a smell, a trace of presence that clung to the air long after you'd gone. Perfume. And what passed for fragrance back then wasn't always pleasant. Before anyone saw your face, they smelled you. And in the Middle Ages, that wasn't always a good thing. Bathing was rare, soap was a privilege, and water, especially in cities, was often more dangerous than dirt. The body was something to be managed, not displayed, certainly not uncovered. But the body persisted. It sweated. It ached. It produced smells, human smells, which clashed violently with the idea of spiritual elegance. So the body had to be corrected, disguised, rewritten through scent. Perfumes, of course, was nothing new. Even in ancient times, people had burned herbs, worn oils, dabbed on tinctures. But in medieval Europe, fragrance became something more, not just luxury, but language. To smell sweet was to smell saved. To smell foul, proof that something inside you, morally, spiritually, was rotting. And so they masked themselves. The wealthy used rosewater, clove oil, musk, ambergris. Not just on the skin, on linens, gloves, fans, even inside their shoes. Tiny sachets were sewn into undergarments, Hollow pendants held drops of scented resin close to the chest. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about control. Because in an age where hell had a smell, heaven needed one too. The church approved certain scents: myrrh, frankincense, lily. These were considered holy, purifying, appropriate. Others, jasmine, patchouli, anything too heavy or exotic, suggested danger, seduction, the East. And that was always complicated, because much of what we call medieval fragrance was imported. Perfumed oils from Baghdad, spices from India, citrus from Moorish Spain. Beauty, as it turned out, was global, even in cloisters. But for the poor, perfume was out of reach. They made do with smoke, burned rosemary to cover the scent of illness, hung bundles of lavender near the bed, scrubbed with vinegar or wine when water ran dry. And for everyone, the ultimate perfume was absence. The absence of filth, of decay, of sin. Smelling like nothing became a goal. Odd how that idea still lingers. Today we praise clean fragrances, scents that smell like skin, like air, like laundry. We wear names like Glossier U or Molecule 01, designed not to overpower, but to suggest that we were born like this. Just as they once sprinkled rosewater not to allure, but to imply holiness. And yet, some couldn't resist the heavier things. A splash of civet, a drop of amber. Something dark, animal, forbidden. Because not everyone wanted to smell like a saint. Some wanted to be remembered, and nothing lingered longer than scent. But fragrance wasn't the only way to leave an impression. There was something more permanent, more visual. Hair. The one part of the body that could burn like gold, move like silk, and betray your entire station at a glance. And in the medieval mind, no beauty was complete without the right head of hair. Which is where we go next, to the long, tangled obsession with the perfect colour. And the terrible things they did to get it. Of all the things beauty promised in the Middle Ages, status, virtue, protection, none burned brighter than blonde hair. Not the soft chestnut of saints, not the raven waves of troubadour poems. Number. It was the gold, hair the colour of sunlight, of angels, of something not quite of this world. And once the idea took hold, it refused to let go. You see it in paintings, in altarpieces, in illuminated manuscripts, Madonnas with halos of flaxen light, queens with braids like spilled honey. Even the Virgin Mary, Middle Eastern by birth, was quietly repainted with the hair of a Scandinavian noblewoman. The message was clear. To be blonde was to be chosen. And for the vast majority of medieval women, that meant one thing: becoming something you were not. Natural blonde hair was rare, especially in Central and Southern Europe, so they faked it. There were no salons, no foils, no Olaplex, just sunlight, lie, and desperation. Women sat for hours under the open sky, their hair soaked in a mixture of ash, alum, crushed herbs, and occasionally horse urine. Anything that might coax the strands a shade lighter. They wore wide-brimmed hats with the top cut out, allowing only the hair to bake in the sun. It was called a solana. Imagine a beauty trend that required physical suffering, strange smells, long hours of exposure, and very little guarantee of success. Sound familiar? Because even now, blonde remains currency. Just look at who gets cast, crowned, filtered. Look at the shelves. Platinum toners, balayage kits, Scandinavian ice masks. We say it's just a colour, but that colour still opens doors. Back then, it was divine. Now, it's aspirational. And just like in the Middle Ages, the process hasn't become kinder. Bleach still damages. It strips, breaks, burns. The formulas may have improved, but the expectation is the same. Lighten, brighten, purify. And yet, even after all that effort, even when the hair glowed like candle flame, it had to be covered. Because beauty, in public, was always dangerous. So married women wore veils, unmarried ones braided theirs in modest styles. Hair was private, tempting. A sign that you could bear children, yes, but also a risk that you might tempt the wrong eyes. Still, everyone noticed it. And that was the point. Hair spoke without speaking. About wealth, about class, about freedom. Because only women who didn't work with their hands, who didn't sweat or toil or bend, could afford to grow it long, treat it gently, and lighten it without ruining the rest of their lives. It was a silent display, one you wore on your back, one that said, without a word, I belong to a higher order. But hair wasn't the only part of the body turned into a message. There was something even more revealing, more scrutinized, more manipulated. The shape, the body itself, and the dangerous line between what was considered womanly and what was considered holy. The body was never just a body. It was a canvas, a battlefield, a set of clues to be read by others, quietly, cruelly, constantly. And in the Middle Ages, the most desirable body wasn't one of flesh and movement. It was an idea. Thin, but not weak. Curved, but not carnal. Soft, but contained. The ideal woman had a narrow waist, a long torso, rounded hips, and high, barely there breasts. Not for function, for symbolism. The shape echoed the Virgin Mary as imagined by the Church, fertile but untouched, delicate but somehow indestructible. And achieving that shape meant submitting to a very old game, one still being played. Of course, corsets weren't yet the steel trap cages they became in later centuries, but the logic was already there. Women laced themselves tightly with stiff bodices, belts, binding cloth. Whalebone, wood, even leather were used to press the body into place. Breath was a luxury. Posture was a prison. It wasn't about what felt right. It was about what looked righteous. The waist became a moral boundary, a measure of control. Too thick, you were indulgent. Too thin, you were sickly. Too visible, you were suspect. And always the line between holiness and hunger blurred. Some saints were praised for starving themselves into ecstasy. Others, for existing almost without bodies at all. Skin and shadow made flesh only to suffer. But regular women had no such luxury. They had to perform the shape. Lacing, padding, restricting, whatever it took to appear sculpted by virtue, not vanity. And here again, we see the echo. Modern shapewear doesn't claim to make you holy. It claims to make you smooth, snatched, effortless. Skims, waist trainers, compression tights with marketing teams. We pretend it's about choice, but much of it still whispers the same message. You are better when contained. In medieval portraits, the most admired female figures are often impossibly narrow at the middle, anatomically suspect, almost floating above the rest of their frame. It wasn't realistic. It wasn't meant to be. It was a fantasy of restraint, of stillness, of a body so untouched by need, it could barely hold breath. And underneath the garments, bruises bloomed, ribs ached, organs shifted, girls fainted at feasts, and were praised for their discipline. To suffer for your silhouette was considered elegant, which sounds absurd, until you remember that we still compliment women for skipping dinner. still admire those who shrink themselves in silence. But the waist was only part of the equation. The rest of the body had its own politics, its own quiet expectations and contradictions, and perhaps the most charged of all, the breast. Symbol of life, of lust, of loss, and no part of the medieval body carried more weight. In myth, in medicine, in shame, no part of the female body was more watched, more weaponized, more mythologized than the breast. It fed, it tempted, it condemned. It was both sacred and obscene, depending on who was looking. In medieval theology, the breast was a vessel, a divine instrument, especially when used to nourish others. The Virgin Mary, again, was the model, often shown in early iconography nursing the infant Christ, her breast exposed not for pleasure, but as proof of her compassion. The image was powerful, but also dangerous, because if one woman's exposed breast could mean salvation, another's could mean sin. It all depended on the context, the frame, the interpretation. A wet nurse could be praised for her generosity, or shamed for her excess. A noblewoman might wear a square neckline that hinted at softness, but not enough to inspire suspicion. And for the rest, compression, binding, concealment. Breasts were to be hidden unless needed. In childbirth, in art, in metaphor. The ideal breast was small, high, barely there. Something tidy, manageable, almost theoretical. Roundness was indulgent. Fullness, carnal. Visible softness, an invitation to judgment. And so, women learned to control the curve, with tight linen shifts, with bone-laced bodices, with posture and shame. Because a woman who let herself go physically, whose body became visible, expansive, uncontainable, was already failing spiritually. Still, fascination grew. Poems praised apple-like chests. Medical texts warned against overuse, confessors asked detailed questions, and behind closed doors, men wrote prayers thinly disguised as fantasies. Centuries later, not much has changed. Breasts still exist under 1,000 lenses: moral, sexual, maternal, political. Too big? You're vulgar. Too small? You're incomplete. Breastfeed? Brave? Don't? Selfish? Show skin? Provocative? Hide it. Dull. Whatever you do, the world has a verdict waiting. Modern fashion still plays the same game. Cutouts, coverage, push-up bras that whisper worthy, straps that signal status. Even athletic wear has its aesthetic code. Flatten, lift, contain. And for every woman who learns to read the rules, there's a man deciding what they mean. But speaking of men, they weren't free from judgment either. Because while the female body bore the weight of morality, the male body had its own expectations to perform. A narrow waist, broad shoulders, smooth skin, flushed cheeks, youth, always youth. And while women were painted into stillness, men were carved into ideals. Next, we turn to them. To the powdered faces, the curled hair, the perfumed gloves, and the delicate art of medieval masculinity. It's tempting to think beauty was only a woman's burden, that men were free to look however they pleased, muddy, bearded, glorious in their disregard. But that's a modern fantasy. In the medieval world, men were beautiful too, or rather expected to be. Not in the way women were, not delicate, not erased, but cultivated, controlled, composed. The nobleman's appearance was no accident. His hair was washed and scented with rosemary, his nails trimmed, his beard if worn at all, shaped with precision. And many faces were powdered just like women's, though the colours were more subdued. A pale complexion still meant purity, still meant power. Even knights, those icons of grit and warfare, often travelled with combs, mirrors, and small flasks of rosewater. Their armour gleamed, their gloves were perfumed, their belts embossed, because beauty was status, and status had to be seen. Of course, not all men played along. Some viewed cosmetics and grooming as suspicious, too soft, too indulgent, too close to femininity. But in royal courts and among the literate elite, presentation mattered deeply, especially the face. The perfect medieval man had high cheekbones, clear skin, a narrow nose. His hair, often curled with hot irons, fell just so. Not too long to be vain, not too short to be brutish. And like women, he walked a tightrope. Appear strong, but not coarse. Refined, but not effeminate. Desirable, but never desiring. Masculinity was not absence of beauty, it was beauty weaponized. And for men of the church, the standards shifted again. They too were expected to embody virtue through appearance, but theirs had to look effortless, unadorned, almost reluctant. Still, the expectations remained. Even monks wrote about posture, tone, expression. A devout man had to look the part, aesthetic in the truest sense, visible holiness. And that brings us to the institution that quietly governed every plucked brow, every painted lip, every decision to hide or reveal, tint or remove. The church. Not just as moral compass, but as tastemaker. Because long before fashion magazines, there were sermons. And before beauty influencers, there were saints. No fashion house ever held as much power as the medieval church. It dictated not only how you should behave, but how you should appear, inside and out. From the height of your neckline to the pallor of your skin, every inch of your body was a theological decision. Too much colour? Vanity? Too much jewellery? Pride? Too tight? Too loose? Too bright? Too soft? The list of sins was long, and they all began in the mirror. But it wasn't just about modesty. It was about imitation. Because the highest form of beauty wasn't natural. It was holy. Women were told to model themselves after the Virgin Mary. Not as she might have looked, but as she appeared in stained glass, untouched, glowing, serene. Her robes clean, her expression neutral. Her hair light, her skin pale. An impossible standard, painted by men, enforced by scripture, and endlessly recycled in sermon and song. And if the Virgin was too far removed, there were other saints to imitate. Martyrs with radiant faces, mystics with ethereal grace, women who starved themselves into transcendence and were praised for their glowing skin. Never mind that it came from slow malnutrition. Their beauty became a sign of virtue, their thinness, proof of closeness to God. And so the faithful followed suit. They fasted, they wept, they avoided mirrors and sought reflection in stained glass instead. But behind the public piety, there was theatre. Relics were adorned with gold, altars draped in silk, holy days came with costumes, perfumes, rituals. Aesthetic mattered, because humans, even when reaching for the divine, could never resist the shimmer of form. The church denounced vanity, but built cathedrals like jewellery boxes. It warned against temptation, but painted saints with flushed cheeks and parted lips. And people noticed. They copied what they saw in chapels and manuscripts, taking style notes from holy faces even as they prayed not to be damned by them. But Christian beauty was not the only influence in medieval Europe. Not by far. Trade, travel, and conquest brought new materials, new scents, new standards. From the spice markets of Damascus to the bathhouses of Cordoba, another kind of beauty shimmered. One that made European women question everything they'd been told about virtue, and European men, everything they thought they wanted. Next, we follow that trail, eastward, outward, to where beauty meant colour, movement, skin, and where modesty came wrapped in silk instead of sermons. Europe in the Middle Ages liked to think of itself as the centre of the world, but its mirrors told a different story. Because what reflected back wasn't always European, not entirely. Hidden in the powders, perfumes, fabrics, and formulas of the wealthy was something older, warmer, more intricate. A beauty from elsewhere. Long before Sephora and social media, there were caravans, ships, spices wrapped in cotton, resins traded for silk. From Al-Andalus and Byzantium, from Baghdad and Cairo, came colours the West could not name, textures it couldn't recreate, scents it had never dreamed of. Rose oil from Persia, saffron from Anatolia. Coal, jet black and ancient, swept across eyes with the same quiet precision it had for centuries. These weren't just commodities, they were ideas. They carried with them a different understanding of the body. Cleanliness wasn't suspicious, fragrance wasn't sinful, makeup wasn't always vanity, it could be protection, health, even wisdom. Arab physicians translated and preserved Roman and Greek medical texts that European scholars had long forgotten. With them came recipes for skin creams, hair dyes, tooth powders, and those recipes travelled first with scholars, then with merchants, and finally into the private rooms of queens and noblewomen who dabbed unfamiliar salves onto their faces and whispered foreign names as if invoking something both forbidden and essential. Even the bath became a borrowed ritual. Islamic hygiene culture, with its scented soaps, scrubbing mitts, and steamy bathhouses, stood in stark contrast to the cold stone tubs and moral panic of the Christian North. European women began to question, why shouldn't beauty feel good? Why must cleanliness mean guilt? Not all adopted these habits publicly. To do so was to risk scandal. But behind closed doors, small revolutions